Dr. Sampson, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start with a quick introduction of you and your lab.
Great. So my name is Matt Sampson. I'm a pediatric nephrologist in the Division of Nephrology at Boston Children's Hospital. And I'm also an associate professor of pediatrics and medicine at Harvard Medical School. And I also have an appointment as an associate member of the Broad Institute, which is a research institute at MIT and Harvard. And I'm also a member of the nephrology division faculty at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is the adult hospital here in town. You know, that's a lot of my titles and background, but really I'm a kid who always, well, now I'm an adult who always wanted to be a pediatrician. Then I got really interested in kidney disease and rare pediatric kidney diseases, and that led me to wanting to try to figure out answers to why these kids were getting kidney diseases and what we could do about it. And now that's led me to a situation here where I am running a research lab here in Boston, trying to understand the real molecular drivers of nephrotic syndrome or rare kidney disease, because it's our belief, and it's based on success in other diseases and conditions, that if we can understand the molecular drivers of disease, then we could work on developing treatments and cures. And the way we like to illuminate the molecular drivers of nephrotic syndrome is through genetics. And that's what led me to start our lab and have our hashtag as KidneyOmics, which is kidney genomics.
So the first thing I want to ask is what nephrotic syndrome actually is.
Yeah, so what nephrotic syndrome is a rare disease of the kidney, and more specifically, injury to the glomerular filtration barrier of the kidney. So let's talk about that for a minute. So one of the kidney's major jobs is to filter blood. So blood's going around your body. It has good things in the blood, like proteins and electrolytes, and it has things that are waste products. And what the kidneys do is they filter your blood many times a day, and they let the bad stuff out and keep the good stuff in. And they do that through through glomeruli. And I have a model here. So if this is the cross section of a kidney right here, then these little guys, these are the filters, they're the glomeruli, and this is a glomerulus blown up, and then this is a glomerulus blown up even more. So what the glomerulus does is these filters, blood comes in through these tubes, and they go through this filtering process, and the waste ends up in the urine down here, and the good things like blood cells and protein go back to the body. So what nephrotic syndrome is an injury to that glomerulus, where the glomerulus all of a sudden leaks a ton of protein. And that creates proteinuria, or protein in the urine. And that leads to an increased risk of infections and an increased risk of blood clots, but it also has a risk of leading to chronic kidney disease and ultimately end-stage kidney disease. So to put it in a nutshell, nephrotic syndrome is an injury to the kidney's filters that selectively results in a massive loss of protein, and it ends up in the urine rather than being in the body where it belongs.
So what are some signs and symptoms people can use to tell that they have nephrotic syndrome?
Yeah, so that's something we think about all the time. And as a nephrologist seeing patients in clinic, I often ask, what was the first thing that you noticed or what happened? And the major symptom or the symptom that a patient will have is swelling. Okay, that's for the most part when someone has like really obvious nephrotic syndrome, they get swollen. They get swollen around their eyes. They get swelling in their legs. Little babies who are smaller may get swelling in their belly or their private parts. And oftentimes what happens is that they go to the doctor and the doctor diagnoses them with allergies because they get swollen around the eyes. But allergy medicines don't typically help. So swelling is the major symptom. Some patients, because they're people with a disease, people with nephrotic syndrome are not walking around being patients. That's not their identity. Some people with this condition don't necessarily have the massive swelling, and that's a little more challenging because it can be a quieter, unrecognized condition, but they might have some fatigue or lower energy. Some people also say that that when they have their nephrotic syndrome, their urine gets foamier than usual. So those are the symptoms. So once we see a patient who we worry about having nephrotic syndrome, we check a urine test to check if there's protein in the urine, and that's called proteinuria, and that we use a urinalysis or a dipstick. And then if the protein is in the urine, then it's not in the bloodstream. So we check the blood for their protein levels, and the major protein in the blood is albumin. So if you have protein in your urine, and then you have low albumin in your blood, and then you have swelling, those are three of the four cardinal features of nephrotic syndrome. And then the fourth one is high cholesterol or lipids in your blood.
What's the demographic of people who usually are diagnosed with nephrotic syndrome?
Yeah. So people can get diagnosed with nephrotic syndrome across their lifespan. And there are a variety of, I'll show you the glomerulus again. So this is the glomerulus that can get injured in nephrotic syndrome. And most often the cell type that's damaged in nephrotic syndrome are these podocytes, these little octopus-looking cells. These are epithelial cells that wrap around the glomerular capillaries or the blood vessels. So there are actually a number of distinct causes of nephrotic syndrome. So there's something called membranous nephropathy, and that's more of a condition of older individuals. There's also steroid-sensitive nephrotic syndrome or minimal change disease, which is what you see on a biopsy, and that's who I see the most. These are kids who typically present between like 3 and 8 years of age. And then there are other forms of nephrotic syndrome that are like FSGS, that's what we see on the biopsy, focal segmental glomerular sclerosis, or steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, and that can occur even outside that range, but even within that range. So it's all complicated because nephrotic syndrome can arise across the lifetime. And just because it looks like nephrotic syndrome, it doesn't mean it's all caused by the same thing, okay? So there are different forms, and it's hard just to tell by someone's response to steroids or what's on the biopsy, what kind they have. So that's what we're trying to use genetics to try to classify these forms more accurately. But the punchline, if you ask me to say, Matt, you talk a lot, you say a lot of different words, but the demographics is nephrotic syndrome can occur across the lifespan, and certain forms of steroid-sensitive nephrotic syndrome, typically in the late toddlerhood to early elementary school, but recognizing that it can happen across childhood, and sometimes the ages of onset can give us some clues, or a person's self-reported race, which reflects their genetic background, can also help us understand it.
Well, you mentioned using genomics to look at what like the differentiators of the types of nephrotic syndrome, like steroid sensitive, steroid resistant. So
Yeah.
what's your specific study surrounding that research area?
Yeah. So what I can tell you is, well, I can tell you so much. Over the past 25 or 30 years, people have realized that looking at someone's DNA sequence and figuring out if they have any differences in their genetic code, that by looking at differences from people who are healthy, that may give a hint about why someone may have nephrotic syndrome. And historically, people looked very painstakingly one gene at a time, and they also required people to have a large family history of nephrotic syndrome to find genetic causes. Fast forward now 20 years, now literally anyone, any child or adult who has nephrotic syndrome can go to the doctor or go to a research study, get genetic testing done, and we can use that information and say, you know, if you're a child and you have steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, that's what your doctors have told you, you have FSGS, and you live in America, then you have about a 10% chance of having a single gene cause or a monogenic form of nephrotic syndrome. If you are a child who has steroid-sensitive nephrotic syndrome or respond to other immunosuppression, you know, your genetic signature is not going to be one of these single gene causes, but you might have a collection of genetic changes that cause mild effects that aren't enough alone to cause the nephrotic syndrome. But if you have this genetic risk plus a second hit, what we call a second hit, like an environmental aspect, an infection, a jellyfish sting, you know, you may get the disease. And then there's this very special group called APOL1 kidney disease, and this is a form of nephrotic syndrome that occurs due to two changes in this gene APOL1, and those genetic changes arose in West Africa about 9,000 years ago. So for the most part, the people who have these APOL1 genetic changes that can cause disease would self-report themselves as black. So if someone self-reports as black, we think about APOL1 kidney disease in a lot of situations. But I want to emphasize that there's subtleties to this as well, and there are people who wouldn't say that they were black, whose identity is not that they are black, who have these genetic variants as well. So I want to give you that as the background. So what we know is now we have these single gene causes that happen rarely but frequently enough in steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome. We have these polygenic causes, these risk alleles that have a small effect but are frequently present in patient children and adults with steroid-sensitive nephrotic syndrome, and then we have this APOL1 kidney disease. But altogether, that still doesn't explain all the genetic basis for nephrotic syndrome. So there's a lot more to discover of new genetic contributors. And there's also a lot of work to be done even for people who we know what their genetic cause is, in terms of what does that mean for their health, what does that mean for their long-term outcomes, and are there medicines we can devise. So we created the BigKids Study, the study that's coming out of our lab here at Boston Children's Hospital, to offer genetic profiling on a research basis to anyone who has childhood onset nephrotic syndrome in the US or around the world. And our goals are to genetically map each individual's profile to see if we can explain why they have their nephrotic syndrome and help us answer what we could do about it.
So on the BigKids Study page and on your Sampson Lab Instagram page, it says that the BigKids Study is a biobank. So can you explain what a biobank actually is?
Sure, absolutely. So a biobank, most simply, is a form of a research study in which patients who consent to be part of the study also consent to having some of their biosamples in this bank. So a biosample can be blood, it can be saliva for DNA extraction, it can be urine, it could even be kidney tissue if someone had a biopsy. So what happens is that we ask for permission to either collect extra biosamples, or in some situations, if you're already having blood drawn, or we ask for the excess, because there's often excess blood that's not being used. So we deposit those samples in the biobank, and then we pair the biosamples with the clinical information that the patients consent to be in. For the patients who consent, they also consent to say, we can have your clinical data. Like, you can have my clinical data. What's my age? When did I develop the disease? Do I have a family history? What medicines am I on? And then we can marry or integrate the clinical data with the biosamples. We can spend money to generate molecular signatures from the biosamples by getting those samples out of the biobank. And then we move forward and ask specific research questions. The thing that makes a biobank distinct from other studies that use biosamples is that a biobank has these samples stored safely and securely and available for many future studies. So the patients are the ones doing the deposit, but then over time, whether it's months or years, we can go to that bank and we withdraw those samples and information to do nephrotic syndrome research.
How is this going to change diagnosis and care and efficiency in the process for patients?
Sure. So to be very clear, our study is a research study. So when we do research genetic testing, part of our consent asks families, if we find what we think is the explanation for your disease, do you want to know about it? And if the families say yes, then we have them identify their primary nephrologist, and then we return information to the primary nephrologist that your patient has a genetic change that we think explains their disease. And then that nephrologist then takes that information without the specific genetic change, and then they get it confirmed on the clinical basis. So there could be a person in Seattle, and they could send a research sample to me, and we could do a genetic research study, and we could say, oh, we think we found the cause. And then they would have already told us we wanted to know, and they could maybe say, oh, my pediatric nephrologist is Daryl Okamura at Seattle Children's Hospital. Sean Jackson at Seattle Children's. And then I would communicate with those doctors and say, hey, your patient has what we think might be this genetic change. you could maybe test it clinically. So that's one way that it works that's more the exception rather than the rule, because we often don't find a single gene cause. And we're not a clinical lab, so we don't immediately do the genetic test on each person within like a week or two. We batch them together for research. So when we batch these together, we then can report, out of 100 kids in our study, how many of them had a single gene cause, or how many of them had APOL1 kidney disease, or how many had, what are the genetic risk factors. And then we can report those back, but we also publish. Okay, we publish in journals, and we do podcasts, and we talk about the value that the genetic testing can bring in terms of making a definitive molecular diagnosis, helping us to give a better prognosis, more specifically what's going to happen, and then maybe identifying opportunities to directly target or treat the disease. And when we publish that, we put it out in the world, then clinical clinicians, people who take care of patients with nephrotic syndrome, they can say, oh, this study out of BigKids, these patients collaborated with Dr. Sampson and his team, and they made these findings. Now let's bring that knowledge into our clinic to take better care of our patients.
And how can patients get involved in this research and this study?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. So there's a number of ways they can do it. One is to go onto our website, which is the samsonlab.org, and there's a link in there to the BigKids Study, and there's a way to reach out and to contact our study team and say, hey, we're interested in learning more about the study to perhaps participate. Another way is we, with amazing work from our social media coordinators in my lab, our handle is at the Sampson Lab, and we're on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky, and for all the old people, Facebook. I think we have a YouTube channel too, so people can check us out there, and there's links within there as well. The other way to do it is, and it's equally valid, is if someone finds out about it from our socials or our website, is to talk to their pediatric nephrologist or pediatrician and say, hey, can you reach out to the Sampson Lab about this, learn a little bit more? So there's a lot of different ways of doing it. But our whole goal is to make it as easy as possible for someone who's interested to learn more about it. Being involved in research studies is a really personal decision, so we are not, our goal is not to trick or force or compel someone to be in a study. But for a lot of people, being in a study is the right choice, and we can provide information about that.
I've heard you talk before about how the Sampson Lab studies the arc from genomic discovery to genomic medicine. Can you expand on what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So the concept is that any kind of test we do in the clinic, whether it's an X-ray or an ultrasound or a blood test, is based on a lot of long-time back-end work in the research labs, whether it's with mice or fruit flies or cells or patient data. And that is, so to ultimately end up being medicine, you have to start with research. And it's the same thing with genomics. When I was in my residency training program to learn how to be a pediatrician and my nephrology fellowship, I was seeing genomic medicine in action. I was seeing how testing for a single gene cause of nephrotic syndrome or polycystic kidney disease, one gene at a time, was allowing us to tell a family, we now know why your child has this disease. We can now better tell you what's going to happen with your child's disease. And we even have a treatment that might be more helpful. So that genomic medicine was incredibly exciting to me. But I got equally excited with the idea of, how can I participate or even drive a research program that looks at patients, people with kidney disease, look at their genetic signatures and discover how many people have a genetic signature, what is the genetic signature, and what does it do. And as I'm a physician scientist, so I see patients in clinic, but I also run my research lab. So I feel like I'm in the most exciting playground because I get to do the genetic discovery work in my lab, and then I get to see it kind of get implemented in action over time through first the publication of papers and multi-center studies or trials, or other people independent of me take our research knowledge and bring it into their own work, and then ultimately translate it towards medicine. So that, to me, that's what really the arc of genomic discovery to genomic medicine is. And I say it's a playground, but it's not to minimize the seriousness of the condition. This isn't playing, but it's an amazing place for me to exercise my brain and my heart and my skills. And in fact, I initially I thought I was going to be a general pediatrician, and I'm so grateful that general pediatricians exist because I have 4 kids, and they really help with a lot of situations. But thankfully, my kids aren't seriously ill or have not been seriously ill. But as a physician and scientist, I'm very, very motivated by fighting serious diseases. And that's why I chose to subspecialize. So when I'm working in my lab or in the clinic, I never ask myself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Or does this even matter? This is like a nephrotic syndrome and other rare pediatric kidney diseases are serious. They can have a long-term impact, and it's incredibly motivating to kind of work on these kind of problems to attack it.
And what are you most excited about in your lab's work right now?
Gosh, I'm excited about so many things, but I guess our lab right now, we're at a really exciting point where the people in our lab are all highly motivated and enthusiastic and really care as much about solving pediatric nephrotic syndrome through genomics as I do. So they come to work ready every day. And they're also a really kind and nice and funny group of people. So we have a nice culture here. So we have this going for us. And then we've really developed amazing relationships with people studying nephrotic syndrome from the US and around the world over the last 15 years. And we're at a really nice point right now where I can say, hey, this is what I'm excellent at, but I need help filling in gaps that I have. And now I have this network from around the world whether I need someone to help me with a mouse study or someone to do like drug development. We have this group together. And finally, the last part of what makes me most excited, so we have the enthusiastic and smart team, we have our worldwide collaborators, and then we're having increased involvement from patients and families of people with nephrotic syndrome. And that is coming together through patient groups, whether it's NephCure, the Nephrotic Syndrome Foundation. I'm going to forget some if I don't call them all out. But these patient advocacy groups. And then we also have just families who are reaching out or have an Instagram site or have a patient page. And so the families are coming together. So this is this amazing soup with all these components that are really allowing us to expand and accelerate our progress towards treatments and cures for rare pediatric kidney diseases, especially nephrotic syndrome.
And outside of your lab, just in kidney research in general, what are some like interesting studies or researchers or labs you see?
Yeah, so gosh, there are so many, and again, this can't be an exhaustive list because we'll be here for the next 3 days, but some research that I've been particularly excited about is the following projects are exciting to me. One is there's a lot of work on creating kidneys on chips or organoids, which are taking people's stem cells and then adding a bunch of factors to be able to turn someone's stem cell into a kidney. And initially, these are amazing tools for us to use in the lab to more closely do experiments on a model that is more accurately representative of patient's disease. But there's also work, people are working hard on trying to figure out how to take stem cells and ultimately build a new kidney. Now it's science fiction, but it's happening. Whether it's going to take 10 years or 15 years or 20 years or maybe even shorter, this idea of regenerative kidney medicine I think is really exciting. I think another exciting area of kidney disease research right now is using developing therapies that are targeted on the immune system to solve glomerular diseases or treat or cure glomerular diseases. So hold on, let me just decline this call. So in these situations, we're realizing that so much of the damage to the kidneys and rare kidney disease comes from immune cell dysfunction, and it's beneficial from a drug therapy perspective because it's a lot easier to target immune cells that circulate around the bloodstream than to directly try to fix the kidney itself using things like gene therapy or cellular therapy. So people are making a lot of moves on manipulating the immune system to try to solve diseases. And then I think the third area of research that I think is really interesting is that people are making amazing use of like these massive biobanks. Our biobank, the BigKids biobank, we have maybe 350 patients right now. But there are biobanks that exist in the U.S. and around the world, like the the All of Us research study or the UK biobank that have collected hundreds of thousands of people who are both healthy and have diseases, and they've collected their clinical data and their genetic information. And there are a lot of questions that can be answered by using biobanks to find patients who have a nephrotic syndrome or other kidney diseases, and then figure out what it means for them, and then what are some of the molecular drivers of it.
Dr. Sampson, thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to close out with a message of hope for people living with nephrotic syndrome today.
Yeah, so I feel really hopeful about the future for nephrotic syndrome care for children and even adults in the U.S. and around the world. We have learned from so many other diseases that if you put together a team that is expert in genetics and molecular biology and clinical outcomes and drug development, then we could increasingly get a improved understanding precisely of what's going on with someone's disease, and that can point us towards mechanisms and ultimately medicines. We have the teams in place to do that right now. We have the technologies that we can bring to bear to understand, and we have a group of physician scientists who are not competing with each other, but rather collaborating with each other to try to get answers as quickly as possible, to get our knowledge into the clinic to ultimately improve the health and care of children with nephrotic syndrome. And this couldn't be done without people like you and family members of people with kidney diseases, advocacy groups. We're all coming together in an exciting way, and we're going from the ground up, and talking to the government, going from the top down, to find ways that are really going to move us forward to have exciting times. Papers are being published right now that are reporting benefits of developed drugs, and drugs are being approved. We see an IgA nephropathy. So this whole landscape of no longer just saying we will diagnose you and then say goodbye, but saying we will diagnose you and then we'll treat you and maybe even cure you, it's becoming more and more possible. So I think people with nephrotic syndrome should feel really hopeful about the future.